All right, sweet. Where'd my thing go? It's right here. She's with me too. All right, so first of all, thank you all for joining me. This is great. Nice packed crowd. Thank you to everyone that coordinates the conference. Jessica Smith, she's my primary point of contact, and I think she works really, really hard to throw this conference. So thank you to everyone for having me back. I was just saying before, I think this is number 7 for this conference, but I always like the unique group here and the attendance. So I appreciate you all coming and supporting. You all know that slide. He says, who are you and why should I care? So I'm Tyler Wrightson. I'm the founder of Leet Cyber Security. Leet Cyber Security used to be a block that way. Now we're a block that way. So we're right downtown. We do work all across the country, all across the world. And we're really on a mission to help organizations secure themselves from hackers and cyber criminals by changing the way that they fundamentally address cybersecurity to one that is threat-centric, pragmatic, and based on the context of their business. And we do that primarily by hacking into them, right? By simulating hackers and cyber criminals, and that's really it. So we have a very unique perspective. My personal background, I've been doing this for, I don't know how long now, 25-ish years, somewhere around there. I've written 2 books, one on wireless network security, the other on hacking and offense security. I tell people, hacking for me is not something that I just do. It's been an obsession of mine for a very long time. So I dug up some old things. This is a 20-year-old Tyler, this was when I created the first public wireless network for a small town, Chatham. It's kind of one of the areas I grew up. And it's funny to read this article because it's like all this futuristic stuff that doesn't exist, and now it's so commonplace. But I thought, for 2 reasons, you can get a better sense that I really have been doing this for a very long time, and also that for my fellow nerds in here, fashion is a skill that anyone can learn. So, you know what I mean? Don't. All right. So real quick, I highly encourage everyone, if you like this content, to sign up to our newsletter. So go to our homepage, subscribe. I promise we do not spam you with any junk. There's 0 sales pitches in our newsletter. We're going to continue this conversation and talk about these types of things and elaborate on some of them. So again, I'll bring this up at the end of the presentation. But again, I encourage you to sign up to our newsletter. So quick show of hands. Who has been in one of my presentations before in this conference? Jesus Christ. Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for coming back. So especially in a room like this, right? This is a good, intimate room. I feel like we got a cool cigar lounge vibe going on here. Interrupt me. If you have questions at all, feel free to just shout it out. Raise your hand if you think I'm in the middle of a thought, and I'll get to you. But yeah, I would much prefer feedback and questions than for me to just go over this content by myself. So again, all this stuff will likely be online at some point in a video, so you might as well take advantage of the fact that we're here together to ask questions. And one of the reasons why I like questions is because it gives me better insight into things that I have not covered, which I should cover when talking about these topics. So please don't hesitate, just shout out. All right, so who is this presentation really designed for? It's ultimately designed for anyone who's involved in cybersecurity at all. And I know that might sound a little generic, but it's true. As you'll see, we'll talk about some really, really important topics that I think everyone needs to know, from the CISO down to the lowest level technician. So if you're writing code or configuring devices or managing systems, whatever it is, this is good stuff that everyone should know, as well as the highest level people. All right, so let's talk real quick about what we're actually going to cover. Why are you all here? And it's simple. We're going to talk about everything. So within science, right, there's this concept of the theory of everything, right, where we can break everything down and describe it in its most basic form. And then we have essentially principles to understand all of science. Trying to get there with hacking, I think we're really, really close. But you'll see the things that we actually talk about here. So first of all, the big ones are attack paths and conversations about risk. And as a real quick question, why did I word it this way? Why conversations and not decisions? Does anyone have a guess?
It's no defined path. There's
Nope. I mean, that's true. Risk is always changing, and there's no defined path. This,
define the appetite first.
you're getting closer there, defining appetite. It's because this is not a single task for one person, right? These are conversations that need to happen at all levels. Technical, CISO, manager, even decision makers, right? CEO, CFO, board of directors, right? This is not just, oh, I need to understand some technical things and I can make better risk decisions. No, this is how do we talk about risk with all these different parties. All right, so first of all, let's define what is hacking. So these are my definitions of hacking. So first, I think it's a very unique game where attackers attack and defenders defend. And for attackers to win, they just need to get to impact with a capital I once. So we'll talk about what that really means. And defenders need to basically stop every attack to win. And this is such an interesting element. I really want you to think about this for a second. Right? What a unique game where defenders cannot win. They can only not lose. Have you all thought about that before? Right? In most adversarial games, right, you both have the opportunity to win. Not so with hacking. So we'll talk about that more in a second. So real quick, I'm not talking about all these other elements that are meaningful when it comes to cybersecurity. So non-malicious insiders and like specifically talking about like accidents and things that they might do. Right? There's some interesting things. I think there's some corollaries and parallels, but that's not what we're talking about. I'm not talking about like natural events. So again, things that might just happen in their statistics. And I'm not talking about any type of compliance risk. I'm talking about hacking, adversarial risk, right? Hackers, cyber criminals, terrorists, that type of thing. So real quick, some basic rules for hacking. Keep that open. A, attackers have all the advantages. I've said this for many years, and I'm starting to feel like maybe I'm being, it's maybe too much hyperbole. But I still really stand by this. And again, we'll cover more of this in a second. And again, here's a key. In this game, attackers are the only ones that get to attack. Defenders don't actually have that opportunity to attack back. And again, without any context, right, you could say, well, sometimes there's instances where you kind of attack back, but that's not really the case, right? The vast majority of the time, if you're like hacking back, you're hacking a victim or a VPS or something unrelated, right? You're not in a position where you can do the same things an attacker can do, get the same outcome, the impact, and win, right? You're just trying to prevent impact. It's so interesting. And again, I know we've covered this before, but there's no mutually assured destruction. So in mutually assured destruction, I'm not going to hit you because I don't want to get hit back. Hackers don't have that. Isn't that crazy? What a weird, interesting game. So a very, very smart person I know, Jeremy Blackthorne, he made the original malware reverse engineering curriculum at RPI. Anyone know him? Yeah, sweet. Yeah, of course you do. So yeah, super smart dude, very nice. I had a good conversation with him one time about this. I was like, hey, hackers have all the advantages. He's like, well, actually, defenders, and it was cool because it was like related to like research he was doing. He's like, defenders, they can design their environment. I think he used the term like kind of like a maze. Right? They can design their environment, and then attackers have to work their way through that maze, and so that's kind of an advantage. And I'm like, okay, that's an interesting one. Like, you're a smart dude. I'll play with that. I'll treat that as if it's true. And I think he was onto something. I think there's definitely an element to that, and we'll cover that more in here. And it's up to you whether or not you define that as an advantage or not. So to me, again, because you can't win as a defender, you can only not lose. I say you have no real advantages, right? So again, we have some things that we can do to make it more difficult for attackers, and that's what we'll come back to maze design in a little bit. But yeah, I kind of stand by my point, which is attackers have all of the advantages. Okay, so quickly, who knows, how would we define how attackers win? Any thoughts? Yep.
When they complete their objective, whatever that might be.
That's an interesting way to put it. I think you're close. You're on the right track. When they complete their objective, whatever that is, yeah? What's their objective?
Initial foothold.
You said a foothold? Initial foothold?
Could be denial of service.
Denial of service. That's a good example. Impact. Oh, you got it. So the key here, when we're talking with a lot of technical people, it's not these things. It's not whether or not you got hacked, or there was business email compromise, or even if they got domain admin. That's not the end goal. If the end goal was domain admin and a hacker just said, I got domain admin, I guess I'm done here, right? Things would look a lot different. That is not the end goal. That's not how they win. They win with one word, so great, whoever said it, impact. And specifically impacting the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the things that you care about. That's really all it comes down to, right? All right, so how do defenders win? Knowing that if attackers win by impact, that's it, exactly. And that's what we should be focused on, is preventing that actual end impact, the capital I impact, right? And so this is what we're going to talk about here, which is stopping the chain before they get to impact. If you do that, you can win as a defender. That's it. It's that simple. I think I'm ready to go now. All right, so tactical steps. So 5 steps that we're going to cover here to actually win the game, and the way I want everyone to start approaching cybersecurity. 1 is you have to actually identify what you care about from a business perspective. Which impacts are meaningful? Because everyone typically approaches it with just, oh, these are the systems I manage, and I know we have this sensitive data, and that'd be bad if that was accessed, but specifically, do we care about it being confidential? Do we care about it being available? Do we care about the integrity of the data? What is it? And again, we'll talk about specific types of assets when we get to that point. Understanding attack paths, so again, how attackers move within an organization. We're going to talk about measuring risk, implementing defense in depth, and preparing for a fight. So it's literally just these 5 steps. So if you want to jot it down, take a picture. Otherwise, follow up with me afterwards. All right, so step 1, defining what your organization cares about. This is the key here. Not what you care about, not just what your role is, right? Oh, I'm just an app developer for this one app. This is all I care about, right? We want to define specifically, have the decision makers tell you, what do we care about with these specific assets, whether it's the data, specific physical assets that we're trying to protect, but what is it? And business functions, so assets and business functions. So again, whether it's how we get paid from customers, the data we receive from them, how we share it with them, what here is meaningful. And again, the interesting part here is that so many times assumptions, especially as technical people, the assumptions we make are wrong. And again, it's where we get to those conversations. So people come up to me and be like, oh, I was told by our CISO we have this vulnerability, but we didn't get it fixed. Isn't that crazy that we didn't fix that vulnerability? I'm like, well, not really, right? Because how does it actually tie back to this? What they care about, what the organization cares about. So this is it, defining what you care about first before you figure out how to protect it. And specifically, which impacts are we trying to prevent, right? Because I guarantee you some of your assumptions are wrong until you write it down and figure out exactly what you're trying to protect. Okay, so this is the number 1 topic. In preparing for this talk, this is what I thought everyone needs to learn about and better understand. This is where so many organizations trip up and fail and just don't understand how actual attackers move in their organization. So if you take away only one thing, it is attack paths, and for everyone to go look at MITRE ATT&CK framework. Who in here has actually checked it out on the website, explored different techniques? 1, 2, okay, 18 people. Who here has not ever checked out MITRE ATT&CK framework? Don't be shy. Awesome, good. So it's such a cool website. So basically what it is it's a big catalog of all the different tactics, techniques, and procedures, all the different ways that attackers actually attack, right? So you have all the different phases here: reconnaissance, resource development, initial access, execution persistence, privilege escalation, defense evasion, credential access, discovery, lateral movement, collection, command and control, exfiltration, impact. Ultimately, anything an attacker can do or has done should fall into one of these phases of an attack, right? So I highly encourage you to just go explore this one time. There's so many interesting things here. So again, if you said, hey, I really want to understand how attackers actually brute force credentials. How does that happen? Online, offline, what does that look like? What are the specific tools they use? It's all here. Tons of really good data, and they link to examples of actual threat groups that have utilized those things. So again, you can go down these crazy rabbit holes and really understand, like, how do hackers hack? It's really awesome. And so again, one of the key things here is that this gives you a good general order as to how an attack path actually looks. So I want to talk to you about actual attack paths. So first, there can be attack paths that are pretty darn short, right? So maybe a hacker does reconnaissance, they gain initial access by exploiting a public-facing application, and maybe that application gives them immediate access to the data that they're looking for, right? So they're affecting confidentiality or maybe availability, but that's it, that's an attack path, right? Some of them can be incredibly short. I have one example, one good public example of the attack path basically being this short. Can anyone think of one? Equifax, public-facing application, they exploited it, ta-da, all the data's there, right? So attack paths can be very short, but they can also be incredibly long, right? So again, hacker performs reconnaissance, they gain initial access, they execute some payload and deploy some sort of persistence module. And again, if I'm speaking too quickly, I got a lot to go through, but please interrupt if anyone has any questions at all about these. They escalate their privileges on that machine. Maybe they access some credentials that are stored on that machine. They look for other systems, right? Maybe they find a cloud system that system has access to. They move laterally to it. And now that system gives them the impact they want, right? Now they have access to that data, and they can disrupt it or exfiltrate it, right? So some attack paths can be a lot longer. So here's the interesting thing, though. That also is not really a great representation of what an actual true attack path looks like, right? Because that was very linear, left to right, and that's not what attack paths actually look like in the real world. So again, reconnaissance, maybe we gain access, we deploy some sort of persistence module, we escalate privileges, we access credentials, we discover new assets, and that allows us to move laterally to it and compromise it via another method, right? So the key here that I want to highlight is that there's like kind of this ping-ponging effect, right? Where again, it's not just like this simple logical progression where a hacker goes from A to Z, right? There's a lot of stuff that happens, right? There's a big path where they're checking for multiple vulnerabilities and they're exploiting them and they're kind of figuring it out as they go. And then they ultimately get to impact. So the key here, right, the one big thing that I think everyone is missing is that ultimately none of this really matters, right? If you can stop the chain anywhere along there, you can win as the defender, right? So all of these things can happen, right? They're not good. I'm not saying, hey, great, a hacker's in our network and they're moving around. But as long as you can stop them before they actually get to impact, that's how defenders win, right? This is what's missing. And so still, that diagram that I gave you is still missing some interesting elements that actually happen during an attack path, right? Which is, an attacker doesn't, again, just magically know what's going to work every time. They're checking for things and they're discovering things. So again, they might say, okay, they've obtained credentials, right? They moved this far, and they're going to start to discover assets. They say, okay, I'm looking for whether it's certain types of vulnerabilities or certain types of hosts, whatever it is, right? And some of those lead them to nowhere, right? But they just were probing, looking for stuff. Then they find something that they can use, and they're back to, okay, I compromised another host, and now I'm moving laterally again. And again, that lateral movement is not just hey, it works every time, and I know exactly what I'm doing, right? They're in this new maze. So they say, oh, I tried moving laterally here. It worked, but it ultimately didn't give me access to anything new. I tried moving laterally here, and it failed, right? Maybe I didn't have actual proper authentication or access. Then finally, after multiple attempts, they find a host that does give them what they want, and then they progress from there. And ultimately, again, that process repeats where they're checking for new things and trying new things. This is a much more accurate representation of an actual attack path, right? With those things that the hacker's trying and just kind of figuring out as they go along, which ultimately leads to impact. So the key here as well, as a defender, these things can happen in your environment. We're trying to stop this, just impact, okay? All of these ones that ultimately didn't get the attack or anything, those are phenomenal opportunities as defenders for you to detect there's malicious activity in your environment and respond and ultimately kill the chain. Because again, in this specific one, and there's a good term, another smart person I know, and his name's escaping me. Who's the dude that refuses to stop talking for 3 hours? Bill? Anyway, he talks a lot because he's really smart. He calls it critical attack path. So ultimately, the attack path that actually matters here is this, then, where is it? I can't even find it. Here it is. Here, 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 right? So as long as we can stop something along that path, we can win that attack path, right? But still, because the hacker's trying these other things that ultimately don't get them anything, those are still great opportunities to detect that they're in our environment, find that actual critical attack path, and kill it. Right? This is what we're missing. Yep.
So my approach, we took this about a year ago when I started, was early alert, so basically detect the recon.
Yep.
So we set up honeypots.
Yeah, great.
Because we figure that's step one.
Yep.
We want to know that they're there.
Yeah, great.
Before they proceed to any of those steps.
Yeah, great. So he said that they set up early detection systems like honeypots, which I love that. We'll get to that in a minute. And I like it, so it seemed like you were starting to get to another concept we're going to talk about in just a second.
They're going to get it.
Yeah.
So I need to know.
Yeah, exactly. So I like the way you phrase it. You're assuming they're going to get in, so you want to know. And so again, this is one of those things where historically, and I made a video about it a little while back if anyone remembers it, where I said, I hate when salespeople say it's not if but when, right? And then just kind of leave it at that, right? But that, giving more context, is saying, hey, look, at some point, someone will have a foothold into your network, and we need to know what are those attack paths that exist in our environment, and then have early detection systems to find out, hey, they're in our environment or they're discovering stuff, right? Let's respond. Let's prevent that ultimate impact. So again, the key here is that all of this, while not good, is not what you are trying to protect against. Again, as a fellow nerd, I feel like too many conversations spin off into that direction of, oh, we got to stop execution, we got to stop lateral movement. It's like, sort of. We need a little more context about your environment. Like, is lateral movement bad? Inherently, it's a little risky because it can be utilized and frequently is utilized by attackers, but it's a function of Windows environments, right? And so maybe there's some legitimate uses. But the point is that we're not trying to necessarily stop this, or at least, most importantly, we're not trying to prioritize this big mess over this, right? If you're busy focusing just on these individual things and you're not focused ultimately on how does this stop the attack path to the ultimate impact, then you've got things backwards. All right, so one critical thing is that vulnerabilities don't exist in a vacuum. And I'm trying to come up with a better way to convey this concept. But ultimately, right, all of these things represent vulnerabilities, right? And just having these vulnerabilities in your environment doesn't mean that, the sky's falling down. Because again, what we're trying to prevent is that, right? So again, the closest I can get to it is again, to think of it more about like natural disasters and just simple statistics, right? There's other vulnerabilities that exist in this environment, and frankly, even these are good examples, right? Where those are vulnerabilities, right? Maybe even stuff like this. But if it's not part of the actual attack path, right, then its priority is lower. You should be focusing on the attack path and the ultimate impact. Okay, so we'll come back to that more in a minute. Is that concept, is that kind of clear? Cool. And again, I think, will I cover it in a minute? Yeah, I will. Yeah, all right, cool. All right, so another interesting element to this that follows attack paths, which is one that's difficult because there's so many different types of preconditions. But again, I want this to become part of the conversation when you're talking about vulnerabilities and risks in your environment, which is what are the preconditions that the attacker needs to have in place to execute said vulnerability? Because again, what's a good one? Here, execution. If to actually take advantage of this vulnerability, ultimately all of these things need to happen first, right? Then we shouldn't be focused exclusively just on these things, right? So again, we'll cover more of these in a minute, but like some good common go-to examples. One year I talked about Telnet, right? So what's the root issue with Telnet? Clear text communications, right? But the preconditions to take advantage of that are that we need to be in a position of power. We need to have a man-in-the-middle attack, most likely. Hacker needs to be in our network doing that. There's some discovery involved. They're making lots of noise, right? Those are good things to understand, preconditions that need to happen. And so again, all of those things are the least important ones when we can just focus on, hey, is there a final path to impact, and have we stopped that? Because again, all of those other things could exist, And all of those other things are opportunities for us to actually detect a hacker in our environment if we have good detective controls. And so again, this should allow people to stop playing whack-a-mole and say, oh, I have all of these vulnerabilities, all of these CVSS-rated, highs and criticals, right? We need to take care of all of them. It's like, where do those vulnerabilities exist in the attack path? If those vulnerabilities exist and there is no valid attack path, what are we worried about? Worried about a hacker hopping in and making some noise? All right, another good concept. Playbooks. So one of the key things is that hackers don't jump into your network and then say, wow, it worked. Time for me to figure out what to do next, right? They have a standard set of actions they are going to take. A lot of them at this point are automated. So again, those discovery scripts and things like that, those happen like as soon as they land. And again, understanding their playbooks and learning more about the specific groups and individuals and how they operate, what they're after ultimately for impact, better understanding those can allow you to make the better maze and find those opportunities for detective controls and preventative controls to prevent that path from existing. Okay? So again, they don't look to reinvent the wheel every single time they land on your network. And there's this concept of, they kind of flow like water. They follow the path of least resistance. So again, with those things in mind, that they're not just going to hop in and say, okay, let's start from scratch. Let's figure out, we'll create something new that's never existed before for this environment, right? We can utilize that in designing our attack paths. And so, of course, hackers innovate. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that they only come in and do the same thing every time. But we're not worried about those things, per se. We're focused on the things we do know and saying, okay, what techniques are going to happen in our environment? And so what should we have detective or preventative controls around? All right, so again, when understanding attack paths, this is not the most important piece. It's just impact, right? All of our controls should really be designed around that. All right, so when I was talking about all this, who in here was thinking about, yeah, but what about 0 days? Was anyone? But that's because I already talked to you about this. Yeah, all right, cool. All right, cool. So the great thing is, again, attack paths with 0 days. 0 days don't exist in a vacuum, right? It's not some magical, mythical thing where it's like, okay, they got to impact because there was a 0 day. The 0 day still exists in an attack path. And does everyone know what a 0 day is? Ultimately, like, a brand new exploit is a good way to look at it, right? Or a vulnerability where the vendor has not released a fix, something like that, okay? But they happen all the time. There's 0 days in your environment right now while we're together, okay? But ultimately understanding, right, and coming up with, hey, is there a path if a hacker lands in different areas or the 0 day gives them different types of things, whether it's, allows them to execute something on our internal network, right? Maybe with like a point and shoot, remote code execution, critical vulnerability. Or does it give them, initial access into our environment? That happens a lot with 0 days. And again, kind of think SolarWinds, right? Where it's their foothold into the network. But a foothold into your network is not the ultimate impact. It's not good, but it's not impact. So again, we can still have a good understanding of attack paths and what the attacker is going to need to do if they drop or land on different types of assets in our environment. And so again, you have multiple opportunities here. If the 0 day gives you initial access to different asset types, as long as you don't have the rest of the chain there, the rest of the attack path, then you can win as the defender, right? It's not good, right? But it's ultimately not the thing we care about, which is impact. All right, so any questions before I move on from attack paths? Sweet. All right, cool. So let's talk briefly about how we measure risk and why it's so difficult. Let me do a quick time check. Sweet. All right. So first, 2 years ago, I gave a talk on this. So who remembers the parameters for quantifying and measuring risk? Yep. Yes, that's great. That is the ultimate likelihood and impact equals risk. What are the other elements before that? Do you remember? Hey, you remember the most important part, so I'm happy about that. All right, cool. It was a threat, utilize an exploit, take advantage of a vulnerability, and that produces some type of impact, right? They gain initial access. Now you take the likelihood of that impact happening, and that's the ultimate risk. right? So fantastic. Do you remember the actual example I used? I'll have to switch it up in the future then. All right, the threat was Jack Nicholson, right? His exploit of choice was an axe. The vulnerability was a wooden door. And the impact is you're going to die, right? So again, threat, exploit, vulnerability equals impact. The likelihood and the impact of those things happening is the ultimate risk. And we talked about how you can adjust different things. You know, if you had a steel door, that's your control, and the risk goes down, all that kind of stuff, right? But these are the ultimate parameters and the things that we should be discussing to understand risk. So again, I cannot highlight this enough. And it's not only a common trap that I see so many people fall into, it's a trap that I've fallen into. There's this new crazy remote code execution 0-day. Hackers are actively exploiting it. That's crazy. It's like, okay, but what's the context of the business? Like, what's going on? Where does that exist in the attack path? Is this an ultimate risk? So the key here is that vulnerability is not synonymous with risk. It's not a one-to-one mapping, right? If there's vulnerability, there is risk. But there could be an absolute critical, crazy, a true 10 out of 10 vulnerability that's ultimately not really a risk to the organization. And again, it's when we stop and have the conversations about all these different things at play that we get to the better spot. So we'll talk about that more in a minute. I heard this great quote recently from a mother, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Anyone heard that saying before? That was new to me. I love it. So again, it made me think about the way most organizations treat vulnerability management, right? Which is sure, if your goal is to, lower the average CVSS score, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, the rating of vulnerabilities in your environment, and that's what you're managing to, like, okay, cool. Did that actually really change the way things might play out if a hacker lands in your network or attacks your external facing systems? Maybe not, probably not, right? So again, we want to move away from this. And what's one of the key things that's missing there when we're just basing things on CVSS? And context is absolutely one of them. My favorite word. Whoever said it, nice job. But there's something specific that we've been talking about. Attack path. Where does that vulnerability exist in the attack path? If it doesn't exist in the attack path, we can likely be prioritizing other things which do. So again, I'm lacking so much context in here, right? If we were talking about specific things, a specific instance, and a specific new vulnerability or 0-day, we could have a much better conversation. But as a whole, if a new vulnerability pops up and you're having that conversation about, hey, look, what is the actual impact to the organization, right? What's the ultimate risk here? It's this. Where does that fall in the attack path? Okay, so let's talk about why those discussions and decisions are so difficult. The first is, who in here has a really good, solid way to define likelihood when it comes to hackers? I don't. It's still kind of like a, kind of a black art. Hey, I know that if I was attacking this organization, these are the types of things I would look for. I think I could find that vulnerability, and then we could utilize it to, move on to these locations. So thus, I think that it's, pretty good likelihood that it's going to get exploited. That's usually how these conversations go. There isn't a really good way to quantify this stuff. Of course, there's good data out there about threat groups and what they do. But again, between the fact that not everyone who gets compromised wants to raise their hand and say, hey, here's everything we know about the attack path and what the attacker did to compromise us, right? It's just, the data is insufficient. So likelihood is actually, being that it's one of the core parameters of the risk equation, and it's incredibly difficult to actually quantify in any meaningful way, it means that we're kind of behind the 8 ball. It's why this whole thing we're talking about is so difficult. Second is, because likelihood is already so difficult, even with just a single vulnerability and a single exploit method, we have to chain all those things together with an attack path and say, hey, look, what is the likelihood an attacker is actually going to be able to find all these different things along the way, exploit them, and get to ultimate impact? It's really, really challenging. I don't actually have a great go-to answer to say, do X, and you'll come to the right conclusions. It involves like a lot of just knowledge about how attackers actually move in environments and the tools they're likely to use and the context of that environment about what they'll be able to find and not find. And it comes down to things like network layout and ACLs and LDAP configuration, Active Directory, all these things. Like all that stuff comes into play with how likely those things are to actually succeed in your environment. And then the third we'll cover in 1 minute because I think it deserves its own point. All right, so real quick, if there is vulnerability, is there a risk? The answer is, in my mind, yes. Even when you have controls in place, you'll get the risk extremely low to a point where it doesn't matter. My point in this slide, which frankly I couldn't think of a good way to really rip through it, but here's the point, right? That's not even really the most relevant question to be asking, and these are the questions that I typically get asked, right? So it's like, hey, look, is this ultimately a risk? And again, it's like, hey, I need more context. I need to understand what's going on. Is there risk? Yeah. I mean, there's always going to be risk. You know what I mean? Especially if there's a new vulnerability, a new threat actor, things like that. Is this serious? Should I care about this? But ultimately, it really comes down to this, right? Every conversation you all have about the controls to put in place, whether or not you fix things and patch things, it should be this. Always be driving for this. And as my fellow technical nerds, right? When you're having those conversations with decision makers, it should be helping drive to this. And again, you can take the reins and be like, look, CISO, this new vulnerability came out. It's a 0-day. It's actively being exploited. Let's figure out if this is an acceptable risk for the organization. If this is something we should just continue on status quo, or do we need to do something about this, right? So real quick show of hands, how many in here know that their organization has critical rated vulnerabilities in their environment? 3 people. That's it? All right, show of hands. Who knows that their organization does not have critical vulnerabilities for a fact? Okay, that's the right answer. Because I've literally not seen a single environment, single environment with 0, doesn't matter the size. Extremely large, Fortune 100, Fortune 20, Fortune 50. Extremely small, little law firm with 10 people. They all have critical rated vulnerabilities, right? So again, it's no longer just about, do we need to remove those vulnerabilities? It's where do those exist in the attack path? Because again, those businesses are continuing, right? And the ones that are doing best are focusing on, okay, we have those vulnerabilities. What are the ultimate risks, and do the attack paths exist to get to impact? That's what this is all about. Okay, let's talk about the root problems with your brains. Who in here is afraid of sharks? Don't be ashamed. They're scary. A good like 10 people. Okay. What was that? All right, raise your hands higher. Who's afraid of sharks? Yeah, they're scary. Okay. So now, what if I told you that on average, 40 times as many people die from cows than from sharks? Okay. Look at this stone cold killer here. Okay, show of hands. Whoever said they were afraid of sharks, now who's more afraid of cows? Who will change their behavior with cows? I just told you they're far more risky. One person, one smartass. Nope, I don't agree with you. I know you're joking, right? And so for a while, I was like, oh, that's a funny, interesting parallel, but it's not a one-to-one, right? Maybe we'll talk about that, how it's like, it's kind of related to cyber. But then I actually started thinking about it. I was like, holy crap, that is exactly the same root issue. It's truly the same thing. And it ultimately boils down to the fact that we are all naturally extremely bad at calculating risk and making decisions based on risk. And so again, literally the exact same thing exists within cybersecurity. We focus so much on the scary things, which a lot of times scary is based on the unknown. Oh, it's a new 0-day. Oh, there's so much we don't know about it yet. There's no fix for it. We're screwed. But you just learn that sometimes that might not even matter. Where those things along the attack path, if we're focusing on killing that chain, we can be better off and leave all the scary things in our environment. Or at least prioritize them lower and get to them later, right? So again, these types of things, and again, the interesting thing is I've fallen victim to this in the past too. Where again, we have, a client calls up, hey, there's this new Microsoft vulnerability. They just released it. It's being actively exploited. What do you think we should do? You got to fix that. That's not good. Publicly facing, maybe the one that comes to mind is that Exchange vulnerability a while back. And then as we started to peel the onion, be like, well, what's the likelihood that they're actually going to find us and exploit us? It's probably pretty good. I mean, Exchange is easy to identify. Now, what about X controls? Wouldn't that help us? Wouldn't that help prevent this? Oh man. Actually, even though there's no fix for this vulnerability, it probably would prevent it. And if nothing else, it would detect on it, and then you could respond. It's like, that lowers the risk. So again, like I myself, I fall victim to this all the time. So you need to, anytime you're in the heat of like, I know this is bad, right? If only the CISO understood how bad this was, or the decision maker like agreed with me, then we would get this fixed. We would get what we need. It's like, well, is it really as bad as it seems? Right? Because it's just human nature to be like, this is my domain. I know how to secure this environment. I'm the technical person, right? But if you pause and say, you know what are the controls we have in place? Is there ultimately a way for the attacker to continue on from here to ultimate impact? And how much is that impact worth to the organization versus just initial access or maybe a small data pool being compromised? Because again, if you're just Chicken Little, always saying, it's Patch Tuesday, stuff's broken, I need more budget, like, you know what I mean? You're going to get what you get. So again, the point I want to make here, which I've fallen victim to before, is without additional context, I would rather have a point-and-shoot remote code execution vulnerability in an environment that's either air-gapped or buried deep within their network versus a large organization where you can enumerate all of the users from their public-facing application. Because we use that all the time when we're doing pen tests and red teams to enumerate everybody, do very simple password spraying, and we have our initial access, and we continue on from there. So again, this has a ton of preconditions. If it's buried deep in the network and we have to find it, we need that initial access, do reconnaissance, discovery, do some exploitation, right? A lot of preconditions where you can find that ahead of time and eradicate that, kill that attack path. And this is just sitting there waiting for you, waiting for us. So again, I understand there's a lot more context to actually make a decision in that case, but the point is, don't just simply do what we all do and assume that it's really bad based on scary stuff. All right. All right, so the big so what? All this stuff together, right? What do I hope you walk away with? It's just this. Winning the game is about designing the proper maze that's specific to the context of the business. Specifically, what impacts are you trying to stop, prevent, or correct? And now knowing how attackers move, at least at a high level, starting to incorporate that into the conversation, right? And then preparing for those fights, right? The fights with attackers once they're actually attacking you. So real quick, just some elements for designing the maze. So again, we've already kind of covered this, but start with the end in mind. Start with those impacts. You have to define those and say, okay, can we create a system where if a hacker lands in our network, it's more difficult to find the paths to this, making them have to be noisier, and we can pick up on them and respond. Again, if you do one thing tactically, like look into playbooks, especially for your type of organization. What will hackers do if they're attacking my network, if they're attacking Active Directory, if they're attacking my application, whatever it is? Understand that they're not just recreating the wheel every time. And specifically utilize that knowledge to force them where you want them to go, whether that's just tripping specific alarms, you have specific logs, honeypots, right? Knowing what they're going to do so that you can set off the alarms. And then confusing them. So I think implementing deceptive controls in environments is something that I wish was done much more frequently, but I understand that you have to be at a certain maturity level to do that. Although I think with some of the good controls out there, they're lowering the bar. And these things are great, essentially controls that'll deceive hackers. So like good examples would be like if they try to enumerate Active Directory and they're probing essentially a non-production Active Directory environment that's just set up for hackers to set off alarms because nobody should utilize that with legitimate reasons. Those are phenomenal controls. That takes all of this into account, right? What are hackers really going to do? Understanding specifically the TTP, so again, that really goes back to playbook, and deploying real defense in depth with all control types at your disposal: preventative, detective, corrective, and deceptive. All right, so last couple points. I've said it for a long time that I think the best way to prepare for dealing with incidents is to treat it like it's going to be a street fight. What I mean by that is that it's all on the terms of the attacker. It's really guerrilla warfare again because you can't really attack back. They get to choose when that happens. You don't, right? It's not you have no say in when that battle actually occurs. There's lower morals and etiquette. So again, I think it's even less like battles and more just like some scrappy street fight. And one of the key points in that is that you do not get actually prepared for a street fight by simply studying and attending talks and watching videos and researching, right? You have to what? Fight. You got to spar. If nothing else, you got to spar, okay? So real quick, how do I think all organizations should spar? Use your own environment. So again, whether you're dealing with, hey, my domain is protecting this application and the data we have, or it's my Active Directory environment, but attack that environment. Find somebody who can spar with you and attack that and run actual TTPs in your environment and make sure, hey, do the preventive controls that I have configured, do they actually work like I expect them to? Do the alarms go off that I expect to go off? And again, one of the keys here is that you're doing it with your own tools. So rather than like going and learning somewhere else on somebody else's range, right? It's, hey, look, do the controls actually work? Are they accessible to me when I need them? That's one of the key things we find during like pen tests and red teams is like, oh yeah, conceptually we understood what we had to do, but we didn't realize how tricky it was going to be when an actual incident happened and we had to act quickly. So again, this is how you find out those details. So again, it's not just, hey, go learn in some nebulous environment. It's your environment. And again, that's, for us, we define that primarily like purple teaming and red teaming, where purple teaming, just runs specific individual elements. So again, if you said, hey, look, we've deployed a honeypot. We know if somebody scans our network with basic ping sweep or something like that, it should set off the alarms, right? So do it in your environment. Try the couple different ways that attackers are likely to scan your environment with ping sweeps, right? Whether that's just scanning all private IP ranges or enumerating Active Directory and scanning those ranges, whatever it is, but run through that and say, okay, the alarm went off. Like if this happens in our environment, it's going to work, right? And red teams is where you kind of take off the gloves a little bit and you go head to head. So find some folks, hey, you're on the red team, you're going to attack us, we're the defenders, we're going to defend in our environment. We're going to make sure if this actually happens that we have easy, ready access to all of our controls and we can respond. So last point, why is everything that we just discussed so difficult even though it's actually relatively easy to comprehend? And I've talked about this point before, which is there's a big difference between working hard, which I think naturally I think it's a human tendency to want to work hard. Stay late, come in on the weekends, respond if there's an emergency, right? That's working hard. But everything I just described is the hard work, right? Like sitting down at a table and having another mind-numbing conversation with a CISO who just doesn't appear to get it, right? No, this is actually bad, and here's why we need budget to deploy this control. That's the hard work, right? And I told you, like again, where I've tripped up in the past with having that same conversation, because again, you go through it. I've had this conversation before. I know what we should do. It's like, oh wait, there's context we need to consider here. That's the hard work. So that's it. That's all I got for today. So any final questions? I'll take questions and I'll say one last time. If you have any other questions or you think you want to learn more about this, we'll be doing free webinars where we talk more about in-depth details about attack paths and TTPs and all that kind of stuff. So, yep.
So I work on cyber deception tools for research for SUNY Albany.
Oh, sick.
And so I work with like honeypots and stuff like that.
Yeah, great.
My question is, you talk a lot about the maze and stuff like that. Are there any tools that you would call out in terms of cyber deception that you would say are particularly good?
I'm not the right person to ask for that because all we do is the attacker side. And so there's very few environments where they actually, so the question was, are there deceptive controls that I would recommend? The short answer is no, I'm not the right person to ask. Some of the folks on my team might have slightly better answers. So give them a quick scan. Any good ideas of deceptive controls? Radio silence. All right, so yeah, sorry. But again, we can kind of chat afterwards. I can find out some of the controls that we have seen in place, which I did like, but none of them come to mind because that's not, we don't sell, deploy, manage any of those things. So good question though. Yep.
I would say look at Open Canary.
I have deployed it.
What is it? Open what?
Open Canary.
Open Canary. Cool.
There's a paid version which is really expensive, or a free version called Open Canary.
That doesn't sound like cybersecurity. So yeah, he said Open Canary is a good deceptive control, free version with a very expensive premium version.
The premium version has like really cool dashboards as opposed to just looking at the email alerts.
Yeah, I gotcha. All right, cool.
I like the open source.
Sweet.
Expanding on that, using the tactic of living off the land, are there any particular files that you find are more beneficial?
Oh, good question. So the question was, when it comes to living off the land, which ultimately means a hacker's not using standard attack tools, they're using more administrative tools and trying to like really fly under the radar. Are there any deceptive, you said specifically deceptive controls or canaries, right? Detective?
Or applications level?
Yeah, great.
Trigger on that.
Great. Well, so the short answer is yes, right? So the question was, with that in mind, are there good go-to like signatures and things that we should trigger on alert on? Frankly, I already thought that that would be an interesting talk to cover on its own. We've done red teams that specifically live off the land only, so I can tell you the things that we have done and we have used. And I have thought about, hey, look, you should be able to trigger alarms on these things. And although in the beginning, I'm sure they're going to be crazy prone to false positives, like these are good indications. I'll preface that first by saying, if you are focusing on that, attackers that are living off the land and trying to really fly under the radar, before you've covered the major common attack paths, I think you're doing it backwards, right? Because again, you're focusing on the crazy esoteric threats, which likelihood is ultimately likely lower, at least compared to, we're going to get like, malware on one of these systems one day, or business email compromise, or compromised credentials. Like, let's make sure we've covered, that path first, and that there's no easy path there with common attack tools, right? So I would say do that first, but I would say like, for us, the big one is Active Directory enumeration. So we're looking at users, groups, network subnets, which actually some of that is stored in Active Directory, trusts. We're looking for password policies and lapse. Lapse dated local administrative password solution stuff is stored in Active Directory. If it's misconfigured inappropriately or incorrectly, that's an easy way for us to get credentials. So anything that revolves around like enumerating the Active Directory, so for us like AD Explorer, PowerShell, things like that, as well as you can trigger on just LDAP queries, but again, crazy noisy. So again, I really want to stress though that before going down that rabbit hole of, hey, what if a crazy advanced live off the land type threat lands in our network, make sure the rest is covered. That should be kind of the last thing when prioritizing attack paths. And we can talk more about it too. Like I'm happy, again, or turn it into a talk and be like, hey, look, this is what we do when we live off the land. Thus, every one of these specific things could turn into an alert. Good question. Anyone else? All right, sweet. Ping me if you got anything else. Thanks for coming.
Great talk, dude. Nice seeing you.
Thanks. Yeah, good seeing you. I'll probably see you around the neighborhood sometime.
Yeah, hopefully.
Later, Rich. Good seeing you. I'll see you around.